Carrie Lynn Dalton. What would it take to convince 12 strangers that someone is dead with no body, no murder weapon, no crime scene, and no confirmed confession from the woman sitting at the defense table? That is not a hypothetical. That is the exact question a San Diego jury had to answer in the spring of 1995 when the state of California asked them to sentence Carrie Lynn Dalton to death for the murder of a 23-year-old woman named Irene Melanie May, a woman whose remains to this day have never been found. The jury said yes. The judge himself admitted from the bench that it was a legitimate question whether a crime had even occurred. And yet, Carrie Lynn Dalton has spent more than 3 decades on death row for it. How does something like that happen? That question sits at the restless center of one of California's most contested capital cases, one that has generated a documentary series, a book written by Dalton's own sister, and more than 2 decades of appeals that have chipped away at the conviction without ever fully dismantling it. Carrie Lynn Dalton was born on January 24, 1960 in Van Nuys, California. Her childhood was fractured early. Her father left the family when she was 6, and the stability that most children take for granted never quite arrived for her. By the time she reached adulthood, her life had drifted deep into the orbit of crystal methamphetamine, a world of transient relationships, small crimes, and the kind of company that rarely leads anywhere redemptive. She had a prior burglary conviction. She was, by June of 1988, a woman who had already made a series of choices that narrowed the road ahead of her considerably. The story of Melanie May begins the day before her disappearance. On June 25, 1988, Melanie, a mother of 3 whose husband Bobby was incarcerated at the time, had just been evicted from her apartment in Lakeside, California. She was gathering her belongings with the help of a woman named Cheryl Ann Baker and a man identified only as George. Carrie Lynn Dalton arrived that afternoon alongside 2 others, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Dalton's anger was focused and specific. She believed Melanie had stolen jewelry from her to fund a drug habit. Whether that belief was grounded in truth or fueled by the paranoia that methamphetamine reliably produces, no one still living can say with certainty. What the prosecution alleged happened next is what sent Dalton to death row. According to testimony at trial, the group, Dalton, her boyfriend Mark Lee Tompkins, Baker, and George, brought Melanie May that night to a trailer at the Live Oak Springs Trailer Park in Boulevard, San Diego County, belonging to a woman named Joanne Fedor. Inside that trailer, witnesses claimed, an extended assault took place. A cast iron frying pan, a knife, a syringe reportedly filled with battery acid. Tompkins, who later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, allegedly described the events in disturbing detail to a fellow inmate, not with remorse, but with something closer to satisfaction. He reportedly said Melanie died slowly and that pain was the name of the game. He also reportedly told this same inmate the body had been disposed of on a nearby Native American reservation to prevent its discovery. That night, a sheriff's deputy was actually called to the same trailer on an unrelated burglary report. He found nothing unusual, no struggle, no evidence of any wrongdoing. He left. Melanie May vanished, and almost nobody noticed right away. She was not reported missing for years. It was not until May 14, 1992, nearly 4 full years after that night, that Dalton was arrested. The delay matters because it speaks to how the case was built. There was no physical evidence collected in the immediate aftermath, no crime scene preserved. By the time investigators acted, the case rested almost entirely on the testimony of people who had themselves been present that night and who had every personal incentive to redirect blame. Cheryl Baker agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. Tompkins pleaded guilty. George was never identified or prosecuted. The trial, presided over by Judge Thomas J. Whelan in San Diego, was a study in legal unease. The judge openly acknowledged on the record that no body had ever been recovered and that the homicide itself was a matter of circumstance rather than physical proof. The defense argued the point with force: no body, no weapons, no confirmed crime scene, no direct confession from Dalton herself. The confessions that did exist were second-hand, relayed through a prosecution investigator. Dalton rejected them entirely. "The thing that makes me the most mad," she told the court, "is that he is lying and he knows he's lying." The jury convicted her regardless. On May 23, 1995, Carrie Lynn Dalton was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, with special circumstances of torture and lying in wait. She was sentenced to death. The jury foreman later remarked that the verdict was driven by the type of murder it was, a comment that, to Dalton supporters, raises uncomfortable questions about whether the severity of the alleged act substituted for the missing weight of evidence. The decades of appeals that followed were long and partial. On May 16, 2019, the California Supreme Court reviewed her conviction and reached a divided conclusion. The court affirmed the first-degree murder conviction and the torture special circumstance, but vacated the lying-in-wait special circumstance and the death sentence tied to the conspiracy count, finding them insufficiently supported. The murder conviction, the one that keeps her eligible for execution, was allowed to stand. California has not executed anyone since 2006. Governor Gavin Newsom's moratorium on executions, expanded in 2019, means Dalton's sentence occupies an unusual legal space. She is condemned on paper, but in practice she is living out a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As of 2025, Carrie Lynn Dalton is 65 years old and remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Her sister, Victoria Ann Thorpe, wrote a book titled Cages, arguing the conviction was a miscarriage of justice. Melanie May's remains have never been recovered. Whether the system reached the right conclusion, or whether a woman has spent the last 30 years imprisoned for a murder that was never conclusively proven, is a question this case, in its stubborn silence, still refuses to answer. Linda Carty. What drives someone to weave such an intricate web of lies that the only escape becomes an unspeakable act? When desperation meets delusion, when fiction collides with reality, how far will a person go to maintain a story they've built around themselves? For Linda Carty, a former teacher who once informed for federal agents, the answer would write itself in one of the most disturbing chapters of Texas criminal history. Born on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts on October 5, 1958, when it was still a British colony, Linda Anita Carty grew up under sunny skies that seemed worlds away from the windowless cell where she would eventually spend her days. She emigrated to the United States in 1982, bringing with her ambitions of a better life. She studied pharmacology at the University of Houston and worked as a primary school teacher, shaping young minds and seemingly building a respectable existence. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Carty's life was marked by brushes with the law. In 1992, she was caught up in auto theft and impersonating an FBI agent. She secured probation by becoming an informant, helping authorities pursue individuals involved in unlawful activities. By May of 2001, Linda's life had begun to unravel. She was separated from her common-law husband, Joseph Corona, and was grasping desperately to salvage what remained of their relationship. In her mind, she had conceived what she believed would be the solution to win him back. She began telling people she was expecting a child. She told Joseph she was pregnant with his son. She told her neighbor, Florence Myers, that she would give birth the very next day. She told another acquaintance that the baby had already arrived and was resting at home. The only problem with this intricate story was its fundamental impossibility. Linda Carty was not pregnant. She had never been pregnant, and as the days passed, the walls of her fabrication began to close in around her. Just blocks away from where Linda lived, a young mother named Joanna Rodriguez had recently welcomed her newborn son into the world. The baby, whom she and her partner Raimundo Cabrera named Ray, was only 4 days old on May 16, 2001. Joanna was 20 years old, adjusting to the overwhelming joy and exhaustion of new motherhood. She had no reason to suspect that anyone would wish her harm. She certainly had no idea that her neighbor had been watching, waiting, and planning. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, what happened next was orchestrated with chilling intention. On that May morning, 3 men burst into Joanna's apartment. Gerald Anderson, Carlos Williams, and Chris Robinson forced their way inside, demanding substances and money. They restrained Joanna, binding her hands and sealing her mouth with tape. Then they took her and her newborn son from the home. Joanna was placed in the trunk of a vehicle, her terror unimaginable as she was separated from her newborn. At some point during her captivity, a plastic bag was placed over her head. She would not survive.
Meanwhile, baby Ray was discovered unharmed in a different vehicle. When authorities were called to investigate the home invasion and disappearance, they interviewed neighbors. One of those neighbors was Florence Myers, the same woman to whom Linda had recently announced her imminent delivery. Myers found Linda's behavior peculiar, especially given that Linda showed no physical signs of having been with child. She shared her concerns with investigators. This tip led authorities directly to Linda Carty.
When officers contacted Linda, she made statements that only deepened their suspicions. She mentioned that two vehicles, one she had rented and another belonging to her daughter, might have been used in connection with what had occurred. She was placed under arrest. She then directed authorities to where both vehicles could be found. In one car, they discovered baby Ray, alive and unharmed. In the trunk of the other, they found Joanna Rodriguez. Linda's fingerprints were found in both vehicles. Investigators also found baby items that Linda had purchased and placed in a hotel room she had rented. The picture that emerged during the investigation and subsequent trial was one of a woman so consumed by her own narrative that she had allegedly set into motion a plan to steal someone else's child. Her three accomplices later testified that she had enlisted them to carry out the abduction. They claimed she had orchestrated the entire scheme. Phone records showed numerous calls between Linda and one of the men on the night of the incident. Linda maintained a different version of events. She insisted she had been set up by the three men, framed because of her past work as an informant. She claimed they were retaliating against her for her cooperation with federal authorities years earlier. Her defense, however, faced significant obstacles. She was assigned Jerry Garino, a court-appointed attorney whose track record was deeply troubling. By the time of Linda's case, Garino had already seen more clients sentenced to the ultimate penalty than perhaps any other defense attorney in the United States. Critics would later point to his representation as severely inadequate. He reportedly did not meet with Linda until shortly before her trial began. He failed to interview key witnesses. He did not investigate potentially helpful information that might have supported her version of events. Because Linda held British citizenship from her birth in St. Kitts when it was still under British rule, she was entitled under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations to have British consular officials notified immediately upon her detention. This notification never happened. The British consulate learned of her arrest and conviction only after her sentencing. Years later, Paul Lynch, the British Consul General in Houston at the time, would state that this breach made a significant difference and that with proper consular support, the outcome might have been entirely different. In February of 2002, a jury found Linda Carty responsible for the passing of Joanna Rodriguez under the law of parties. She was sentenced to the ultimate punishment available under Texas law. Over the years that followed, Linda and her supporters pursued numerous appeals, arguing ineffective legal representation, withheld information, and violations of international treaty obligations. The British government submitted formal briefs to the United States Supreme Court on her behalf. Human rights activists, including Bianca Jagger, took up her cause. Yet every appeal has been denied. In November of 2018, the Supreme Court declined to hear her case. Today, Linda Carty remains on the unit at Mountain View in Texas, now in her mid-60s. She continues to maintain her innocence, insisting she was framed by those who wish to silence her for her past cooperation with authorities. Whether she is a mastermind who orchestrated an unspeakable act or a woman wrongly convicted remains a question her supporters refuse to stop asking. What is certain is that Joanna Rodriguez, a young mother with her entire life ahead of her, is gone. Her son Ray grew up without her, and Linda Carty awaits her fate in a small cell, one of only a handful of women facing the ultimate penalty in Texas, and the only British citizen among them.
Melissa Lucio. A child is gone. A mother is weeping. And somewhere in the brutal arithmetic of grief and suspicion, a state decides that the woman crying the hardest must be the one who caused the pain. That is not always how it works, but in the story of Melissa Lucio, a border town mother of 12 who has spent nearly 2 decades on Texas death row, it may be exactly what happened, and the slow unraveling of her case has forced the state of Texas to confront a question it does not want to answer. What if the system condemned the wrong woman? Melissa Elizabeth Lucio was born on June 18, 1969 in Lubbock, Texas. Her childhood was marked by absence and harm from the very beginning. Her father died when she was an infant, and her mother eventually relocated the family to the Rio Grande Valley. By the time Melissa was 7 years old, she was being subjected to sexual abuse by her mother's boyfriend, a violation that would shape, in ways impossible to fully measure, the woman she became. She was 16 when she married for the first time, a child bride whose husband was a violent alcoholic and drug dealer. That marriage produced 5 children before it collapsed. Her next relationship, with a man named Robert Alvarez, followed the same pattern of abuse. 7 more children came from that union, including the youngest, a little girl named Mariah. By the time Melissa was 35, she had 12 children, a history of trauma that would fill a clinical file, and a life perched permanently on the edge of poverty. On February 15, 2007, the family was in the middle of moving to a new apartment in Harlingen, Texas. The exterior staircase leading to the unit was steep. Mariah, who according to her mother's legal team had physical instability that made her prone to falls, tumbled down those stairs. Melissa said the toddler did not appear critically hurt afterward. 2 days later, on the morning of February 17th, the little girl could not be woken from a nap. Paramedics were called. Mariah was rushed to hospital. She did not survive. She was 2 years old. Within hours of her daughter's death, Melissa Lucio was taken in for questioning. What followed over the next several hours has since become one of the most scrutinized interrogations in Texas legal history. Texas Ranger Victor Escalon questioned her for approximately 7 hours, without a lawyer present, without food, without water. She said she had not harmed her daughter. She said it again. She would ultimately say it more than 100 times. But Escalon pressed harder, telling her they already knew what happened, asking her whether she was a cold-blooded killer or simply a frustrated mother who had taken her anger on the child. After hours of that sustained pressure, Melissa Lucio, a woman with a lifetime of conditioning that had taught her to absorb blame, to defer, to yield, finally said the words that would send her to death row. "I guess I did it. I'm responsible." Was that a confession? The world's leading experts on false confessions would later say no. 2 internationally recognized researchers, David Thompson and Dr. Gisli Gudjonsson, analyzed the interrogation recording and concluded that Lucio's admissions were unreliable, a regurgitation of the facts and framing that Escalon had fed her throughout the session. They noted that her psychological profile, shaped by decades of abuse and a diagnosis encompassing PTSD, battered woman syndrome, and intellectual impairments, made her acutely vulnerable to exactly the kind of interrogation she was subjected to. The trial took place in 2008 in Brownsville, Texas. The case against Lucio rested almost entirely on that interrogation tape and the testimony of a medical examiner who told the jury that Mariah's injuries could only have been caused by intentional abuse inflicted shortly before her death. What the jury never heard was substantial. Lucio's own children, including the one who witnessed Mariah fall down the stairs, were never called to testify. Evidence that another child had been physical with Mariah was quietly set aside. The psychologist and social worker prepared to explain how Lucio's trauma history made her susceptible to a false confession were barred from testifying. The defense attorney who failed to present any of this would, shortly after the trial concluded, go on to become a Cameron County prosecutor. On July 10, 2008, the jury found Melissa Lucio guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to death. She became the first Latina woman to receive a death sentence in the state of Texas. The years that followed were a long, grinding accumulation of doubt. Medical experts who reviewed the autopsy determined that Mariah showed signs of a blood coagulation disorder, which produces extensive bruising throughout the body, bruising that prosecutors had presented to the jury as evidence of abuse. A pediatric orthopedic surgeon reviewed the broken arm cited at trial and concluded it was a common toddler injury entirely consistent with a fall from standing height, and nothing about it indicated an intentional act. A Cornell Law School professor who reviewed the full case called it without hesitation by far the weakest capital case I have ever seen. In January 2022, Lucio's execution was formally scheduled for April 27th of that year. What happened next was extraordinary.
more than 100 bipartisan Texas lawmakers signed letters urging clemency. 5 of the original jurors came forward to say they had serious concerns about evidence they had never been shown. Kim Kardashian and hundreds of anti-violence organizations added their voices to a chorus that had grown impossible to ignore. Then, just 2 days before the scheduled execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay and sent the case back to the lower court for review of new evidence. When a state representative called Lucio in her cell to deliver the news, she could be heard on the recording laughing and crying at the same time, asking over and over, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" In April 2024, Judge Arturo Nelson, the same judge who had presided over her original trial, found that the prosecution team had illegally suppressed critical evidence showing that Mariah's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall. He subsequently declared Melissa Lucio to be actually innocent, writing that no rational juror could have convicted her after hearing all the evidence. The case now sits before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the only body with authority to act on that recommendation. As of 2025, Melissa Lucio is 55 years old and remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She leads a Bible study group. She prays daily. She waits. A woman condemned for a crime that the judge who condemned her now says never happened, waiting on the decision of a court that moves at its own pace, while time moves at its own.
Amelia Lily Carr. Can jealousy truly transform someone into something unrecognizable? Is it possible that the person who whispers, "I love you" in one breath could orchestrate violence in the next? When does obsession cross the line from emotional pain into something far more sinister? The answers to these questions lie in the story of Amelia Lily Carr, a woman whose choices would shatter multiple families and leave behind questions that haunt everyone who examines her case. Amelia Lily Carr was born on August 4, 1984, the second of 3 sisters. Those who knew her in her younger years described someone with intelligence. A psychologist would later estimate her IQ at 125. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and Amelia's childhood was marked by darkness that would shape the trajectory of her entire life. At 15 years old, she reported abuse by her father to her school. The courage it took to speak up was immense, yet she withdrew her statement to officials. Years later, in February of 2004, her father was convicted of attempting to solicit the deaths of his own family, including Amelia, her mother, and one of her sisters. He received 4 years in prison for this attempt. By the time Amelia reached adulthood, her personal life had become a series of complicated relationships and legal troubles. She had been married twice and had filed a restraining order against one of her former husbands for domestic violence. She was also sentenced to 2 years of probation for her involvement in her ex-husband's theft of exotic birds. By the time the events of 2009 unfolded, Amelia had 3 children with different partners. Her life seemed to be a cycle of relationships that began with hope and ended in conflict. In November of 2008, Amelia became engaged to a man named Joshua Damian Fulgham. She was expecting a child with him, her 4th. She believed they would build a future together. But 1 month later, in December, Joshua married someone else entirely. Her name was Heather Strong. Heather was 26 years old, the mother of 2 children she shared with Joshua from a previous relationship. According to Amelia's mother, who would later testify, Amelia simply could not believe what had happened. The man who had promised to marry her had chosen another woman instead. Heather Strong was trying to build a new life. She had moved on from Joshua and was living with another man, helping him care for his children. That work relationship had turned into something more intimate. But Joshua continued to reach out to Heather, and according to witnesses, he would harass both her and her new partner. Then, in a turn that surprised many, Heather left her new relationship and returned to Joshua. They married, but the union was troubled from the start. Within a week of their wedding, Heather was calling law enforcement about her new husband. Joshua found himself sitting in jail on domestic violence charges. While Joshua was locked up, he rekindled his relationship with Amelia, who was now 7 months pregnant with his child.
Phone calls from the jail were recorded, and in those conversations, prosecutors would later argue, the seeds of a plan were planted. Joshua and Amelia began discussing Heather. They talked about her as an obstacle, someone who was ruining their chance at happiness together. The conversations revealed a growing animosity, a shared belief that Heather was the problem standing between them and the life they wanted. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong was lured to a storage trailer behind the home of Amelia's mother, Maria, in Boardman, a community in North Marion County, Florida. What happened next would be described by prosecutors as planned and deliberate. According to evidence presented at trial, when Heather arrived and realized something was wrong, she tried to leave. A struggle ensued. Joshua held Heather down while Amelia used duct tape to bind her to a computer chair. The details that emerged during the investigation were deeply disturbing. Undercover audio recorded Amelia discussing the events with Joshua's sister. In recorded statements to law enforcement, Amelia admitted that Joshua had asked her to attempt to break Heather's neck. She told officers, "I didn't really try." When that method failed, a plastic bag was placed over Heather's head. Heather Strong died of asphyxiation while restrained in that chair.
Joshua was arrested first on suspicion of fraud for using Heather's credit cards after she had disappeared. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, they turned their attention to Amelia. In March of 2009, while in custody at Marion County Jail, Amelia gave birth to her fourth child, a daughter fathered by Joshua. Her family gained custody of her 3 older children, while the newborn daughter was later adopted. During questioning, Amelia provided a confession to investigators. However, she later claimed that she had only confessed because she desperately wanted to be reunited with her children. She maintained that the statements were coerced, that she had been manipulated into admitting to actions she did not truly commit. But the physical and testimonial evidence painted a different picture. Her 3 accomplices, including Joshua, testified that she had been heavily involved in planning what occurred. Phone records showed numerous calls between Amelia and Joshua in the time leading up to Heather's disappearance. In November of 2009, State Circuit Judge Willard Pope declined Amelia's request for a continuance of the trial. She had expressed concerns about the preparedness of her defense attorney, Candace Hawthorne, but the judge determined the trial would proceed. The case went before a jury in December of 2010. After just 2.5 hours of deliberations on December 7th, the jury found Amelia Carr guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. During the penalty phase of the trial, Amelia's family testified on her behalf. They spoke about the trauma she had endured since early childhood, the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her father and grandfather. They painted a picture of a woman whose life had been shaped by violence and dysfunction from the very beginning. The defense argued that these factors should be weighed as significant mitigation. On December 10th, the jury voted 7-5 in favor of recommending the ultimate penalty. On February 22, 2011, Judge Pope formally sentenced Amelia Carr to face execution by injection. Joshua Fulgham went on trial for his alleged participation in the crime in April of 2012. He pleaded guilty and received 2 consecutive sentences of life in prison. The disparity in their sentences would become a central issue in Amelia's appeals. Her attorneys argued that she had been portrayed as the mastermind, while Joshua, who had also participated, received a lesser punishment. They questioned whether she had received effective legal representation and whether the punishment was proportionate, given that her co-defendant would never face execution. In 2015, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed her conviction and sentence, but Amelia continued to fight. She raised claims of ineffective assistance from her lawyer and pointed to the disparity between her sentence and Joshua's. Then, in 2017, something significant happened. The landscape of Florida's capital punishment system had been changing. The United States Supreme Court had ruled Florida's scheme unconstitutional in January of 2016, requiring revisions to how juries made their recommendations. On May 19, 2017, during an evidentiary hearing on Amelia's appeal, the state declined to seek a new penalty phase. Judge Willard Pope resentenced Amelia Carr, then 32 years old, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would never be executed. She would, however, never walk free.
Today, Amelia Carr remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution in Marion County, Florida. She is no longer one of the women facing execution in that state. Instead, she will spend the remainder of her days behind bars, living with the weight of her actions and the loss of the children she will never raise. Heather Strong's 2 children grew up without their mother. Amelia's own children scattered into different homes, their lives forever altered by choices made in jealousy and anger. The question of who was more responsible, Amelia or Joshua, may never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. What cannot be disputed is that Heather Strong is gone, and the ripples of that February day continue to spread through the lives of everyone connected to this tragedy.
Christy Scott. Most people carry some version of a running list in their minds, the things they would do for their children without thinking twice. They would go without food. They would surrender sleep. They would step in front of anything coming. It is the most automatic instinct a human being possesses. So when a case arrives that inverts that instinct entirely, when the evidence points not to a stranger, not to an accident, but to the one person a child trusted most completely, something in the human mind resists it, refuses it. And yet the facts of Christy Scott's case do not bend to that resistance. They simply stand there, waiting to be reckoned with. Christy Michelle Scott was born on August 10, 1978 in Russellville, Alabama, a small town in the northwestern corner of the state where everybody tends to know everybody, and where a family tragedy does not stay private for long. She married a man named Jeremy Scott, and together they had 2 sons, Mason and Noah. Mason was the older of the 2. He was 6 years old in the summer of 2008, mildly autistic, and by multiple accounts, a child who required more patience than his mother was willing to give. Witnesses who knew the family described Christy's relationship with Mason as visibly different from the warmth she showed his younger brother. She was harder on Mason. She spoke to him more sharply. She pushed him on the morning of the last day of his life, at school drop-off, in full view of other parents. None of that on its own makes a person a criminal, but the timeline of what Christy Scott did in the 48 hours before Mason died tells a story that no coincidence can adequately explain. In the spring and early summer of 2008, Christy Scott took out 2 life insurance policies on Mason, one for $50,000 through Alpha Insurance in May, and a second for $25,000 through the same company in June. She took out identical coverage on Noah at the same time. Then, on the afternoon of August 15, 2008, the day before Mason died, she visited a Woodman of the World insurance office and applied for a 3rd policy on Mason, this one for $100,000. The application was completed and the policy was issued that same day. Within 12 hours, a fire broke out in the boys' bedroom of the Scott home on Senior Drive in Russellville. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning on August 16th when a neighbor noticed the flames and called emergency services. Christy Scott and 4-year-old Noah got out of the house. Mason did not. By the time firefighters brought the fire under control, the little boy was gone. He died from smoke inhalation and burns. The fire had originated near his bed. In the immediate hours and days that followed, Christy Scott's behavior became the subject of quiet but mounting unease among those around her. She did not carry herself the way people expected a grieving mother to carry herself. On the day of Mason's death, she and Jeremy visited a hair salon for Jeremy's scheduled appointment.
They joked with the stylist. Mason's name was not mentioned once during the 20-minute visit. At the funeral, a witness recalled Christy holding a relative's baby and saying that Noah had always wanted a baby sister, and maybe now he could have one. These were not the words of a woman destroyed by loss. They were the words of someone whose attention had already moved forward. Fire investigators arrived at the scene and began working through the debris. What they found shifted the inquiry permanently. Firefighters had sifted through the remains of the boys' bedroom for 8 to 10 hours and could not locate one of the electrical outlets, the very outlet behind Mason's bed that the defense would later argue could have caused an accidental fire. Photographs of the outlet existed, but the physical outlet itself was gone. More telling still was what investigators found in the hallway outside the bedroom, a smoke detector, undamaged by the fire, lying on the floor. It had been removed from the wall before the blaze began. A
A forensic expert testified that in his opinion, the device had been forcibly pulled from its mount. Had it remained in place, it would have sounded the moment smoke entered the hallway. Mason, who was in that room, would have been alerted. He might have had time to get out. Beyond the scene itself, investigators began pulling on other threads. Christy Scott had been connected to at least 5 fires over the preceding 8 years, including blazes at the homes of her father and grandmother. In 2005 alone, the Scott family home caught fire twice within the same week. Arson was never proven in those earlier incidents, but the pattern was difficult to dismiss. It spoke to something habitual, a woman who had learned, at some point, that fire was a tool. The trial began on June 12, 2009 in Franklin County. The prosecution's case was meticulous. The defense argued the fire was accidental, caused by a faulty television set inside a wooden cabinet in the boys' room. Their fire experts testified that the state's investigators had relied on outdated methodology and reached conclusions the science could not support. Christy Scott took the stand and maintained her innocence, telling the jury she had no idea how the fire started and loved her son deeply. The jury deliberated for just over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of capital murder. In the penalty phase, however, the same jury voted 7-5 in favor of life without parole rather than death. That was not the end of it. On August 5, 2009, Circuit Judge Terry Dempsey overrode the jury's recommendation and sentenced Christy Scott to death by lethal injection, a move he justified by calling the crime especially cruel and by stating from the bench that death was the only sentence justice permitted. He was one of the last judges in Alabama to exercise that override power. In April 2017, the state legislature abolished judicial override, giving juries the final say on capital sentences. The law was not made retroactive. Christy Scott's death sentence remained. As of 2025, Christy Michelle Scott is 46 years old and remains on death row at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. No execution date has been set. Mason Scott, the little boy who was tucked into bed for the last time on the night of August 15, 2008, was 6 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him, and the person who was supposed to guard that life decided 12 hours before she ended it that it was worth $100,000.
Virginia Cottle. How does a single $20 bill set into motion a sequence of events that ends in unimaginable tragedy? Can the grip of addiction truly transform someone's moral compass so completely that even the most fundamental boundaries dissolve? When does the person you once knew become someone capable of actions you could never have predicted? These questions haunt the story of Virginia Susan Cottle, a woman whose desperate need for substances would lead her to commit an act that would place her in a category occupied by almost no one else in Kentucky's legal history. Virginia Susan Cottle was born on September 10, 1960. Her early life remains largely outside the public record, but by the time she reached her late 30s, her existence had become defined by a struggle with substance dependence. She had been engaged to a man whose mother, 73-year-old Lynetta Penman White, lived in Lexington, Kentucky. For reasons that remain unclear, the engagement fell apart. Virginia moved out of the White family home, the relationship ended, and what had once been a connection between Virginia and the elderly woman transformed into something far more complicated. By March of 1998, Virginia's life had spiraled. She was frequenting places where individuals sought and used illegal substances. On March 15th, she encountered someone from her past at one of these locations. His name was Jonathan Wayne Goforth, and she had not seen him in approximately 15 years. What happened next would become the subject of conflicting accounts, finger-pointing, and ultimately dual convictions that would send both of them to await the ultimate punishment. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, Virginia and Jonathan made their way to the home of Lynetta White. Virginia asked the elderly woman for $20 to rent a room. Mrs. White gave Virginia the money, and Virginia spent it on substances. But $20 was not enough. Virginia and Jonathan returned to the home. This time, they did not simply ask. What occurred inside that house in the early morning hours would horrify investigators and the community alike. Lynetta White was attacked inside her own home. The weapon used was a hammer. The injuries she sustained were catastrophic. An autopsy would later reveal that she had suffered massive trauma to her head. Whether she died quickly or suffered through the attack is a question that haunts those who knew her.
What is certain is that a woman who had lived 73 years, who had raised a family and built a life, was taken from this world in her own living room by two people who wanted what little she had. After Lynetta White lost her life, Virginia and Jonathan did not simply flee, they ransacked the home, searching for anything of value. They took jewelry, they took 2 firearms, they took a mink coat. Then they made a decision that speaks to an effort to conceal what they had done. They wrapped her body in a carpet and carried it to the garage. They loaded her into the trunk of her own vehicle. Then they drove that car several miles away to a field in a rural area of Lexington. They doused the vehicle with gasoline and set it ablaze, attempting to destroy any trace of their actions. But fire reveals as much as it conceals. When authorities discovered the burning car and extinguished the flames, they found Lynetta White's remains in the trunk. The investigation that followed would eventually lead police to 2 names, Virginia Cottle and Jonathan Goforth. Warrants were issued for their arrests, but by then, both had fled Kentucky.
They scattered to different states, trying to outrun the consequences of what they had done. On October 31, 1998, the crime documentary series America's Most Wanted covered the case and sent out a public appeal for information. The broadcast would prove instrumental. On November 12, 1998, Virginia Cottle was arrested while detained at a facility in New Orleans, Louisiana, for unrelated theft charges under the alias Kelly Lyons. A fellow prisoner recognized her from the television program and alerted authorities. Virginia was extradited back to Kentucky. Jonathan Goforth was arrested shortly thereafter in Gulfport, Mississippi, on December 8, 1998. When questioned separately, both Virginia and Jonathan pointed fingers at one another. Virginia claimed that Jonathan had committed the act while she was restrained in another room, unable to stop what was happening. Jonathan insisted that Virginia had wielded the weapon and that she was the one responsible. He even fabricated a story about an unidentified individual assisting Virginia, a claim he later admitted at trial was completely false. The trial became a significant moment in Kentucky's legal history. Both were charged with multiple offenses: capital offense, first-degree robbery, first-degree burglary, second-degree arson, and tampering with physical evidence. The evidence against them was substantial. There were witness statements. There was forensic evidence linking both defendants to the scene. There was the undeniable fact that Lynetta White's valuables had been taken and her body hidden in her own car. On March 24, 2000, the jury returned with verdicts. Both Virginia Cottle and Jonathan Goforth were found guilty on all charges. Then came the penalty phase. The decision was unanimous. Both were sentenced to face the ultimate penalty under Kentucky law. The verdict marked a rare and historically significant moment. It was the first occasion in Kentucky in the modern era where white defendants were sentenced to face execution for taking the life of an African American person. Lynetta White was African American. Virginia Cottle and Jonathan Goforth were both white. Virginia became the first woman sent to await execution in Kentucky since 1987, when another woman's sentence had been commuted. Fayette County Circuit Judge John Adams formalized the jury's recommendation, and both defendants were sent to their respective facilities to await their fates. Over the years that followed, both pursued appeals. They argued that their attorneys had been ineffective. Virginia specifically claimed that if an expert witness had testified about blood spatter evidence, the outcome might have been different. She maintained that she had not been the one to deliver the blows. These appeals were denied repeatedly. In 2014, a federal judge rejected Virginia's claims after concluding that her attorney had not been deficient and that there was no evidence supporting her version of events. The judge noted that Virginia had made no attempt to flee when the attack began, had followed Jonathan as he drove the car containing Lynetta's body to the remote location, and had continued to associate with him for months afterward. By 2019, Virginia Cottle had exhausted her appeals. She remains incarcerated at the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women in Pewee Valley, the only woman on Kentucky's roster of those awaiting execution. Her accomplice, Jonathan Goforth, passed away while still on death row on June 14, 2025. He never faced execution. Due to a moratorium in place since 2010 regarding injection protocols, no executions have been carried out in Kentucky since 2008. Virginia Cottle has not been assigned an execution date. Today, Virginia Cottle is 64 years old. She continues to maintain that she was not the primary actor in what happened to Lynetta White. But the courts, the jury, and the weight of evidence have all reached a different conclusion.
What remains undeniable is that Lynetta White, a 73-year-old woman who gave Virginia Cottle $20 when asked, lost her life in the most violent way imaginable. Her family mourned, her community grieved, and Virginia Cottle became a name forever associated with one of Kentucky's most discussed legal cases. A woman who will spend whatever days remain to her behind bars, waiting for an execution date that may never come.
Karla Faye Tucker. 14 years is a long time to wait to die. It is long enough to earn a college degree twice over, to watch a child grow from infancy to adolescence, to become, in every measurable sense, a different person than the one who walked through the prison gates. Karla, it is one of the most uncomfortable questions the American justice system has ever been forced to sit with. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959, in Houston, Texas, the youngest of 3 sisters. The household she grew up in was fractured from the start. Her parents' marriage was volatile, and the family fell apart when Karla was 10 years old, the same year she discovered, during her parents' divorce proceedings, that the man she believed to be her father was not. By that point, drug use had already entered her life. According to those who interviewed her later, she was smoking and experimenting with substances by the age of 8. By 11, she had moved into harder drugs. By 12, she was traveling across the country with her mother, a rock band groupie, and working as a child sex worker. The childhood that should have protected her instead accelerated her destruction. At 16, she briefly married an auto mechanic named Stephen Griffith. The marriage did not last. By her early 20s, she was in a relationship with a man named Daniel Ryan Garrett, and together they inhabited a world built almost entirely around drug use and the reckless decisions that world produces. In the early hours of June 13, 1983, Tucker and Garrett, along with a third man named James Librant, left Tucker's residence after a prolonged session of drug and alcohol use. The destination was the Houston apartment of a man named Jerry Lynn Dean, someone Tucker had clashed with before, a man she disliked intensely. The stated intention was to intimidate Dean, collect money he owed, and possibly take his motorcycle. What happened inside that apartment went far beyond what anyone had planned, or at least far beyond what anyone admitted to planning. The pair used a pickaxe they found inside the apartment to fatally attack Dean. A 21-year-old woman named Deborah Ruth Thornton, who had been asleep in Dean's apartment and had nothing whatsoever to do with any prior dispute, was also attacked and fatally injured. She was simply in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Tucker and Garrett were arrested and brought to trial in April 1984. The prosecution's case was aided significantly by a recorded conversation obtained when Garrett's own brother, deeply disturbed by what he had heard, agreed to wear a hidden recording device. Tucker's words on that tape were damaging and left the jury little room for reasonable doubt. The defense called no witnesses. Karla Faye Tucker was convicted of the murder of Jerry Lynn Dean and sentenced to death. Garrett received a death sentence as well, though he would die of liver disease in prison in 1993, never facing the execution chamber. What happened to Tucker in the years that followed her sentencing is where this story takes its most complicated turn. While awaiting trial in the Harris County Jail, still coming down from years of sustained drug use, she encountered prison ministry workers who introduced her to Christianity. Something in those conversations took hold. By the time she arrived on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, Karla Faye Tucker was a genuinely, visibly transformed person. She was not performing rehabilitation for a parole board or crafting a sympathetic image for the media. She studied scripture, counseled other inmates, and earned the respect of prison staff across 14 years in ways that people in positions of authority found impossible to dismiss. In 1995, she married the prison minister who had helped guide her conversion, the Reverend Dana Lane Brown. As her execution date approached, the movement to spare her life became one of the most extraordinary coalitions in American death penalty history. Pope John Paul II appealed directly to Texas for clemency. So did the World Council of Churches. Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi weighed in. Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich expressed support.
Pat Robertson, the televangelist who had always championed capital punishment, changed his position specifically for Karla Faye Tucker and lobbied Governor George W. Bush to commute her sentence to life without parole. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the voice of Ronald Carlson, the brother of Deborah Ruth Thornton, one of Tucker's victims, who had himself undergone a religious conversion and now stood publicly against the execution of the woman who had contributed to his sister's death. The Coalition for Mercy crossed every ideological and political boundary. It had no precedent. Governor Bush applied his standard two-question test. Was there any doubt about guilt? Did the defendant have full access to legal protections? The answers were no and yes. On those grounds alone, he declined to intervene. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected the clemency petition on January 28, 1998. The United States Supreme Court denied a final stay on the day of the execution. Every door closed. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker was transported from Gatesville to the Huntsville unit. Her last meal was a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. She barely touched it. She selected 4 witnesses to accompany her: her sister, Carrie Weeks, her husband, Dana Brown, and 2 close friends. The witnesses for the victims included Deborah Thornton's husband, Richard, who watched in silence and when it was over, told the room the world was better for it. Tucker's final words were a message of love directed at the people present and at God. Lethal chemicals were administered at 6:37 in the evening. She was pronounced dead at 6:45. She was 38 years old. Karla Faye Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas since Chipita Rodriguez was hanged in 1863, and only the second woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. She was buried at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery in Houston, the same city where 15 years earlier she had walked into a stranger's apartment and made a choice that no amount of transformation could entirely undo. Her case did not resolve the debate it ignited, it deepened it, and that debate about guilt and change, about what justice actually demands, about whether a person can outgrow what they once were, has never fully gone away.
Christina Marie Riggs. She did not run, she did not lie, she did not construct an alibi or point a finger at a stranger in the dark. When investigators arrived at the Sherwood, Arkansas duplex on the morning of November 5, 1997, Christina Marie Riggs, a licensed practical nurse who understood precisely what she had done, was found unconscious on her kitchen floor, having turned the same method she had used on her children against herself. She had wanted to die alongside them. She had failed. And when she recovered and faced a courtroom 8 months later, she did not ask for mercy. She asked for death. She told the jury without hesitation, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies. I want you to give me the death penalty." What do you do with a woman like that? What does a justice system built around punishment do when the person it seeks to punish is already punishing herself more thoroughly than any sentence could? Christina Marie Riggs was born on September 2, 1971, in Lawton, Oklahoma. Her childhood was defined almost entirely by harm that arrived long before she was old enough to understand or resist it. Beginning at the age of 7, she was subjected to sexual abuse by her stepbrother and later by a neighbor, violations that stretched across years and left marks on her psychological development that no amount of time would fully erase. By 14, she had turned to alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. At 16, she became pregnant and gave the child up for adoption, a decision she would carry with her for the rest of her life. That early surrender of a child, forced by circumstance and age, planted a seed of guilt in Christina Riggs that would grow quietly for years, feeding on every subsequent loss and disappointment life sent her way. She graduated high school and, demonstrating a resilience that makes her story all the more complicated, went on to become a licensed practical nurse, a profession built on the impulse to heal, to monitor, to protect. She worked at a Veterans Administration hospital and later at the Arkansas Heart Hospital in Little Rock. She was, professionally, a person other people trusted with their lives. That detail matters because it sits in such stark contrast to what came later.
Her personal life was a series of fractures that never fully healed. The father of her son Justin, a serviceman named Timothy Thompson, stationed at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, denied paternity and left for Minnesota before Justin Dalton Thomas was born on June 7, 1992. She reconnected with a former boyfriend, John Riggs, who eventually married her in July of 1993, the same night she suffered a miscarriage. Their daughter, Shelby Alexis Riggs, was born in December of 1994. The marriage ended after John struck Justin hard enough to require medical attention. By 1995, Christina had moved to Sherwood, Arkansas, to be near her mother, working 2 jobs to support 2 children alone, cycling through debt and depression and the particular exhaustion of a person who was holding everything together with nothing left in reserve. She was prescribed Prozac. She described her days in a prison interview as a grinding loop. The more she worked, the more she needed childcare, and the more guilt she felt for not being present. The system that should have caught her, a woman with a documented mental health history, working in medicine, clearly deteriorating, did not. On the night of November 4, 1997, after putting 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby to bed, Christina Riggs enacted a plan she had been turning over in her mind for some time. She mixed the antidepressant amitriptyline with water and gave it to both children to drink, waiting for the sedative effect to take hold. She then attempted to administer a lethal injection to Justin using potassium chloride she had taken from the hospital. She had not diluted it correctly, and instead of the peaceful end she had planned, Justin woke in severe distress. She responded immediately, injecting him with morphine to ease the pain, a nurse's instinct operating inside a mother's breakdown. When that alone did not end his suffering, she smothered him with a pillow.
She then took Shelby's life the same way, without the injection, having witnessed what the undiluted drug had done to her son. She then attempted to take her own life, swallowing 28 amitriptyline tablets and injecting herself with potassium chloride. Her intention had always been that none of them would be found alive. The plan, in the end, held for 2 of the 3. The following morning, her mother Carol Thomas arrived at the duplex and found the scene. She called for help. Emergency responders were able to revive Christina. The children could not be saved. At trial in June of 1998, Christina's defense argued that she had been suffering from severe major depression to such a degree that she could not appreciate the wrongness of her actions, a recognized legal standard for not guilty by reason of mental defect. 3 psychiatric experts testified on her behalf. The 7-women, 5-man jury deliberated for just 55 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Then came the penalty phase, and Christina Riggs made a decision that stunned the courtroom. She refused to allow her attorneys to mount any defense for her life. She stood and addressed the jury directly, telling them she wanted to die, that she wanted to be reunited with her children, and that she was asking them to sentence her to death. The jury complied. What followed was a 2-year legal battle she did not want. Her attorneys appealed over her objection. Courts debated her competency to waive her own right to appeal, a question that required multiple psychiatric evaluations. Each assessment found her competent in the legal sense. She understood what she was doing and why. She was not delusional. She was a woman who had concluded with full awareness that there was nothing left for her on the side of the living. In January of 2000, the Arkansas Supreme Court accepted her waiver. No clemency application was filed. Governor Mike Huckabee, clearly uncomfortable with what he called the historic nature of the moment, ultimately did not intervene. On May 2, 2000, Christina Marie Riggs was transported to the execution chamber at the Cummins Unit in Grady, Arkansas. Medical staff struggled for nearly 20 minutes to find a viable vein, eventually using one in her wrist. When the lethal injection finally began, her last words were directed entirely at Justin and Shelby. No words can express just how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. Now I can be with my babies, as I always intended. She was pronounced dead at 9:28 in the evening. She was 28 years old, the youngest woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976,
and the first woman executed in Arkansas since 1845. Christina Riggs did not die protesting her innocence. She died insisting she deserved exactly what she got. Whether that certainty was the product of genuine remorse, profound mental illness, or the complicated grief of a woman who had lost herself long before that November night is a question her case leaves permanently, uncomfortably open.
Velma Barfield. She attended church regularly. She quoted scripture. She cared for the sick and elderly with gentle hands and a warm smile. To her neighbors and community, Velma Barfield appeared to be exactly what a good Christian woman should be: compassionate, devoted, and selfless. But what happens when the person mixing your medicine also holds the poison? What happens when the caregiver becomes the greatest threat? The story of Velma Barfield forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we trust the most. Margie Velma Bullard was born on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, North Carolina, but was raised near Fayetteville. She was one of 9 children growing up on a small tobacco and cotton farm during the Great Depression. Her father was reportedly physically abusive, and her mother did not intervene. The household was strict Pentecostal Christian, with religious devotion woven into every aspect of daily life. Young Velma found her escape at 17 when she dropped out of school to marry her boyfriend, Thomas Burke, in 1949. For more than 15 years, the couple lived in Parkton, North Carolina, raising their 2 children in what appeared to be a stable family. But everything changed in 1965 when Thomas Burke was involved in a serious automobile accident. He suffered a concussion and began experiencing persistent headaches. To cope with the pain, he turned increasingly to alcohol. Velma, meanwhile, had undergone a hysterectomy and developed chronic back pain. She was prescribed various medications and gradually became dependent on prescription tranquilizers and painkillers. The drugs altered her personality, and the marriage that had once been harmonious descended into bitter arguments. On April 4, 1969, tragedy struck. While Velma and the children were away running errands, the family home mysteriously caught fire. Thomas Burke was found deceased inside, having apparently succumbed to smoke inhalation after passing out from drinking. Or so it seemed at the time. No one suspected anything unusual. A grieving widow was left to rebuild her life. Only a few months after Thomas Burke passed away, Velma began dating a widower named Jennings Barfield. The two married in August 1970. This second marriage would prove remarkably brief. Jennings Barfield passed away on March 21, 1971, from what was determined to be heart failure. Once again widowed, Velma moved into her parents' home in Fayetteville. Her father passed away from lung cancer not long after she arrived. In the summer of 1974, Velma's mother began complaining of severe stomach pains. She was admitted to an area hospital but sent home when her symptoms subsided. In December of that same year, Velma's mother, Lily McMillian Bullard, again showed symptoms of a serious stomach illness. She was rushed to the hospital and pronounced deceased only 2 hours after being admitted. The doctors were unable to diagnose Lily Bullard's illness, nor was an autopsy performed. In 1975, Velma Barfield served 6 months in prison for writing several bad checks. Upon her release, she found work that seemed perfectly suited to her nurturing image. She became a caregiver for the elderly. Velma secured a job as a home health nurse for an elderly couple, 94-year-old Montgomery Edwards and his 84-year-old Dolly Edwards. In January 1977, Montgomery Edwards passed away. Only a few weeks later, in late February 1977, Dolly Edwards was also gone, having developed a strange stomach virus. Velma Barfield was reassigned to care for a second elderly couple, John Henry in Record Lee. John Henry Lee passed away in June 1977, his doctors diagnosing it only as a severe stomach virus. Later in 1977, Velma moved in with her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. He was a widower, and the relationship appeared to bring stability to Velma's life, but her addiction to prescription medications continued to drain her finances. She began forging checks on Stuart's account to feed her habit.
One day, while Velma and Stewart were attending a Pentecostal revival meeting in Cumberland County, North Carolina, Stewart began to complain of severe stomach pain. He was later admitted to the hospital and passed away within a matter of days. But this time, something was different. There was an autopsy, which found that the cause of Taylor's passing was arsenic poisoning, and Velma was arrested and charged.
The investigation that followed peeled back layers of deception spanning nearly a decade. Authorities began to notice a disturbing pattern. Everywhere Velma Barfield had been, people had developed sudden, violent stomach illnesses and perished. After her arrest and the subsequent investigation, authorities discovered a pattern of mysterious losses around Barfield. She eventually confessed to 3 other instances, including that of her own mother. In her confession, Barfield claimed that she poisoned the others to hide the fact that she had stolen money from each to support her addiction to tranquilizers and painkillers. She argued that she only intended to make them sick to give her time to restore the funds she had taken. Interestingly, her 2 husbands also passed away under unusual circumstances. Though it was believed she had a hand in those outcomes as well, she denied any involvement. The method was always the same: arsenic-based rat poison, carefully mixed into food or beverages. The symptoms were consistent: vomiting, diarrhea, intense stomach pain, and Velma was always there, the concerned caregiver, ready to rush her victims to the hospital when their conditions worsened. Velma Barfield went to trial in November of 1978 for the passing of Stewart Taylor. The venue was transferred due to pretrial publicity. At the trial, her defense pleaded insanity, but this was not accepted and she was convicted. One particularly striking moment came when Velma appeared cold and uncaring on the stand and gave the district attorney a round of applause when he made his closing speech. On December 2, 1984, following the jury's recommendation, Judge Henry McKinnon sentenced Velma Barfield to face execution. She would become the first woman on North Carolina's roster of those awaiting this fate in modern times. For 6 years, Barfield's attorneys filed appeals to overturn her conviction, but all failed. They argued that Barfield, due to her excessive substance use, did not realize what she was doing would result in the ending of her victims' lives. Their goal was to get her removed from the roster and have her sentence reduced to life in prison. During her stay awaiting execution, Barfield became a devout Christian. Her last few years were spent ministering to prisoners, for which she received praise from evangelist Billy Graham. Her religious transformation was so complete that significant efforts were made to have her sentence commuted to life imprisonment. Anne Graham Lotz, daughter of Billy Graham, befriended her and even volunteered to witness her final moments. Many people believed Velma had genuinely changed, that she had overcome her addiction and found redemption through faith. But North Carolina Governor James B. Hunt denied clemency. He cited justice for the victims, crime deterrence, and the fact that poisoning is a particularly agonizing way to end someone's life. Critics suggested his decision was influenced by his close Senate race against Jesse Helms, though Hunt denied this. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield from Cumberland County became the first woman in the nation executed by injection. She was 52 years old. She was the first woman executed in the United States since 1962 and the first in North Carolina since 1944. She released a statement before the execution. "I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who have been supporting me all these 6 years." For her last meal, she chose cheese snacks and Coca-Cola. Velma Barfield's case remains one of the most discussed in American criminal justice history. She shattered every stereotype about what a perpetrator looks like. There was no rage, no obvious violence, no dramatic crime scenes, just a quiet, church-going grandmother who used poison to solve her problems and fund her addiction. Her victims were people who trusted her completely: her own mother, her romantic partners, elderly individuals under her care. She betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible.
The question that haunts her story is whether she truly changed during those 6 years awaiting execution. Did her religious conversion represent genuine transformation, or was it simply another performance from someone who had spent years deceiving everyone around her? We will never know for certain. What we do know is that at least 6 people are gone because Velma Barfield decided their lives were worth less than her secrets.
Teresa Lewis. 2 men pulled the triggers. 2 men entered the home. 2 men carried out the act that ended 2 lives on the night of October 30th, 2002. And yet it was not those 2 men who were strapped to a gurney 8 years later. It was the woman prosecutors said put the plan together. A woman with an IQ of 72, a dependent personality disorder, and no prior record of violence. The 2 trigger men received life sentences. Teresa Lewis received death. The sentencing judge called her the head of the serpent, then declined to execute the serpent's hands. That contradiction sat at the center of one of the most bitterly contested capital cases in modern American history, and it followed Teresa Lewis all the way to the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia, where she died on September 23, 2010, the first woman executed in Virginia in 98 years. Teresa Wilson was born on September 26, 1969 in Danville, Virginia, a small industrial city in the southern part of the state where both of her parents worked in textile mills. The family had little, and Teresa's childhood offered even less in the way of stability. She dropped out of high school at 16 and married a man she had met at church, a union that produced 1 daughter, Christy Lynn Bean, before ending in divorce. What followed was a stretch of years defined by low-wage work, alcohol, painkillers, and the particular kind of drift that settles over a life when nothing in it seems to be moving toward anything better. In the spring of 2000, Teresa found work at the Dan River Textile Mill in Danville, where her supervisor was a recent widower named Julian Clifton Lewis Jr. Julian had 3 adult children, Jason, Charles, and Kathy. He was steady, employed, and kind, and the relationship that developed between him and Teresa moved quickly. Teresa and her teenage daughter Christy moved into Julian's home in June of 2000, and the couple married shortly after. The early years of the marriage appeared, from the outside, to be as settled as Teresa's life had ever been. Then the money entered the picture. In December 2001, Julian's older son Jason was killed in a car accident, leaving behind a $200,000 life insurance payout. Julian used that money to purchase a manufactured home on 5 acres of land in Pittsylvania County. In August 2002, Julian's younger son Charles, known as CJ, obtained a $250,000 life insurance policy ahead of his deployment to Iraq as part of the United States Army Reserve. Charles named his father as the primary beneficiary and Teresa as the secondary. The math was not complicated, but what Teresa did with it was. In the fall of 2002, Teresa met 2 young men, 21-year-old Matthew Jesse Schallenberger and 19-year-old Rodney Lamont Fuller, at a Walmart in Danville. She began relationships with both of them. In October, with Charles due home on a visit from Army training in Maryland, Teresa withdrew $1,200 from her bank account. The money was used to purchase firearms and ammunition. On the first attempt, Schallenberger and Fuller followed Julian along his route home from work, planning to intercept him and make the killing look like a robbery. That plan fell apart. A second plan was set. On the night of October 30th, Teresa left the back door of the family's mobile home unlocked and put their pit bull in a separate room so the dog would not interfere. Julian and Charles were asleep. Teresa waited in the kitchen as the 2 men entered and carried out the attacks. Charles was shot multiple times in his bedroom. Julian was struck in his bedroom and survived long enough to be found still alive by sheriff's deputies when they arrived. Conscious and bleeding, he managed to say something that destroyed whatever alibi his wife had been constructing. "My wife knows who done this to me." Julian Lewis died from his injuries. Charles Lewis was already gone. Teresa waited approximately 45 minutes before calling 911. While she waited, she went through Julian's wallet and removed $300, which she later divided between Schallenberger and Fuller before they left. When investigators arrived and interviewed her, she claimed the 2 men had been killed in a home invasion by unknown assailants.
Within days, she was caught attempting to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's bank account using a forged check. Less than a week after the murders, she confessed. At trial, the prosecution argued that Teresa was the architect of the entire scheme, that the money was her motive, the plan was her design, and the two young men were instruments she had recruited and directed. The sentencing judge agreed emphatically, declaring her the head of this serpent and imposing the death penalty. Schallenberger and Fuller, who had actually carried out the killings, were each sentenced to life without parole. Schallenberger died in prison in 2006, having taken his own life. What complicated the picture and what fueled years of international debate was what emerged after the sentencing. Teresa's IQ testing placed her between 70 and 73, just above the legal threshold that would have prohibited her execution under the Supreme Court's ruling in Atkins Accord Vigna. 3 forensic psychology experts testified that she had dependent personality disorder, a condition that made independent functioning in even routine situations extremely difficult. More significantly, a letter surfaced written by Schallenberger himself to a fellow inmate in 2003, in which he stated plainly, "From the moment I met her, I knew she was someone who could be easily manipulated. Killing Julian and Charles Lewis was entirely my idea." The man identified by the prosecution as a mere triggerman had, in his own handwriting, claimed ownership of the plan the court had attributed to Teresa. The European Union formally appealed to Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell for clemency, citing Teresa's mental limitations. The governor declined. The United States Supreme Court refused to hear her appeal. Every avenue of relief was exhausted. In the days before her execution, Teresa spent her time praying and singing hymns. Her attorneys described her as peaceful, having long accepted the outcome. She had written a farewell letter to her fellow inmates at the Fluvanna Correctional Center that was read aloud at a prison service. "Man wants me to die," she wrote, "but I'm not worrying over this. I'm trusting Jesus." On the evening of September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was escorted into the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. Witnesses described her as visibly frightened, her jaw clenched as she was guided to the gurney. When asked if she had final words, she spoke directly to her stepdaughter, Kathy Clifton, daughter of Julian and sister of CJ, who was present as a witness. "I just want Kathy to know that I love her," she said, "and I am very sorry." Lethal injection was administered. She was pronounced dead at 9:13 in the evening. She was 41 years old, the 12th woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976, and the last person ever to be executed in Virginia before the state abolished the death penalty entirely on March 24, 2021. The law changed 11 years too late for Teresa Lewis.
What happens when the person you pledge your life to becomes your executioner? When does a pattern of marriages become something far more sinister than simply bad luck? And how many times can a spouse vanish before anyone starts asking the right questions? For Betty Lou Beets, a woman who walked down the aisle 6 times, these questions would remain unanswered until a homemade wishing well in her Texas front yard gave up its terrible secrets. Betty Lou Dunavant was born on March 12, 1937 in Roxborough, North Carolina. Her childhood was marked by poverty and pain. She grew up in a household where violence was routine, where her father's alcoholism cast a long shadow over the family, and where her mother's mental illness left young Betty Lou to care for her younger siblings when she was only 12 years old. A childhood bout of measles left her nearly death. She claimed that she was also the victim of abuse by her own father, though these allegations only surfaced years later. At 15, she married her first husband, Robert Franklin Branson, escaping one difficult situation only to find herself trapped in another. Over the next several decades, Betty Lou would marry 5 more times. She later claimed that nearly all of these marriages were marked by violence and abuse, that she had been beaten, controlled, and terrorized by the men she married. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface of these relationships, a pattern that would only become visible when investigators finally started looking closely at the men who had disappeared from Betty Lou's life. In August of 1983, Betty Lou Beets reported that her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas fire captain, had gone missing from their home near Cedar Creek Lake in Henderson County, Texas.
She told authorities that he had headed out on a fishing trip and never returned. 6 days later, his boat was discovered washed ashore near the Redwood Beach Marina. Inside the boat, investigators found his heart medication scattered about. The assumption was that Jimmy Don, who had a heart condition, had suffered a medical emergency and fallen overboard. For 3 weeks, law enforcement dragged the lake searching for his body. They found nothing. Betty Lou appeared distraught. She spoke of her missing husband with what seemed like genuine concern. But within weeks of his disappearance, she began making inquiries about collecting his pension and life insurance benefits. To neighbors and friends, it seemed like she was moving on rather quickly from the loss. Still, no one suspected anything beyond perhaps an unseemly eagerness to access financial resources. After all, Jimmy Don's boat had been found. The medication was there. It all seemed to add up to a tragic accident. But Betty Lou's son, Robert Branson, knew differently. He would later testify that his mother had told him she intended to end Jimmy Don's life and that she had instructed him to leave the house. When he returned 2 hours later, he found Jimmy Don deceased with 2 gunshot wounds. Robert helped his mother conceal the body beneath the ground in the front yard, directly under a decorative wishing well that Jimmy Don had built for her. Then, at Betty Lou's direction, Robert helped stage the fishing accident by placing some of Jimmy Don's medication in the boat and abandoning it in the lake. The deception worked, at least for a while. For nearly 2 years, Jimmy Don Beats' body remained hidden beneath that wishing well while Betty Lou went about her life. She collected his benefits, she continued living in their home, she gave no indication that anything was amiss. But in June of 1985, investigators received information that would change everything. A man who had been romantically involved with Betty Lou came forward with a disturbing story. He told authorities that after a night of heavy drinking, Betty Lou had made a shocking confession. She had told him that the last man she had been with, she had ended his life and buried him in her front yard. Armed with this information and a search warrant, Henderson County Sheriff's deputies descended on Betty Lou's property. What they uncovered was beyond anything they had anticipated. In the filled-in wishing well, they found the remains of Jimmy Don Beats. He had been shot twice in the head with a .38 caliber pistol. But the horror didn't end there. As investigators continued searching the property, they made a second discovery. Buried beneath an auger shed in the garage were the remains of Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty Lou's 4th husband. He too had been shot in the head with the same weapon.
Doyle had disappeared in October of 1981 during what Betty Lou had claimed was a fishing trip. Like Jimmy Don, his body had never been found. Until now. Betty Lou Beats was arrested and charged with the passing of Jimmy Don Beats. Prosecutors alleged that she had committed the act for financial gain, specifically to collect on a $100,000 life insurance policy and his pension. Her trial began on July 11, 1985 in Henderson County. She pleaded not guilty and made a claim that would shock the courtroom. She accused 2 of her own children of committing the acts, insisting that she had no involvement in either man's passing. The evidence against her was substantial. Her son Robert testified about how he had helped bury Jimmy Don at his mother's direction. Her daughter Shirley testified that she had helped bury Doyle Barker. The ballistics matched. The bodies were right where her children said they would be. And investigators had uncovered that Betty Lou had attempted to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on Jimmy Don without his knowledge, shortly before his disappearance. On October 11, 1985, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Betty Lou Beats guilty. 3 days later, during the penalty phase, they sentenced her to face execution. What made Betty Lou's case particularly controversial was what the jury never heard. Her defense attorney, E. Ray Andrews, failed to present crucial information that might have altered the outcome. He never told the jury about Betty Lou's lifelong history of documented abuse. He never presented evidence of the beating she had endured, the head injury she had sustained, or the psychological trauma that had shaped her entire existence. Most damning of all, Andrews had a severe conflict of interest. Betty Lou had first approached him more than a year after Jimmy Don's disappearance to help with a fire insurance claim. It was Andrews who had informed her about the life insurance policy and pension. When she was later arrested, he agreed to represent her at trial, making it impossible for him to testify about when she had actually learned of those benefits, information that directly contradicted the prosecution's motive. Years later, it would emerge that Andrews had been far more interested in the media attention than in defending his client.
He reportedly told people that the case was going to make him rich, that it would become a movie, and that he had secured all the rights. He allegedly drank heavily before court appearances. In 1994, Andrews was arrested by the FBI for attempting to solicit a $300,000 payoff to drop charges in another case. He resigned, surrendered his law license, and admitted to being an alcoholic and prescription medication abuser. Betty Lou's appeals lasted 15 years. In 1991, a federal judge actually granted her a new trial, ruling that her attorney's conduct had violated her constitutional rights. But Texas appealed, and the decision was overturned. Throughout her time awaiting execution, Betty Lou maintained that she had not committed the acts. She claimed that if anything had happened, she had blocked it from her memory due to trauma. She became deeply religious, ministering to other prisoners and earning praise from evangelist Billy Graham. His daughter, Anne Graham Lotz, befriended her and volunteered to witness her final moments. Despite appeals from domestic violence organizations, human rights groups, and even international observers, Texas Governor George W. Bush declined to grant clemency. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 15-0 to deny her request for a reprieve. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed by injection at the Huntsville unit. She was 62 years old, a great-grandmother, and the second woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of capital punishment. She declined a final meal. She offered no final statement. At 6:18 in the evening, she was pronounced deceased. Betty Lou Beets' story remains one of the most debated cases in Texas criminal justice history. Was she a calculating black widow who ended the lives of multiple husbands for financial gain? Or was she a severely traumatized woman who had endured decades of violence and finally fought back in the only way she knew how? The jury heard only half the story. The complete truth about what happened beneath that wishing well, and whether Betty Lou Beets deserved to face execution, may never be fully known.
Shauna Ford. Most people who claim to stand for something, a cause, a community, a principle, find their limit eventually. They discover the point where commitment ends and conscience begins, and they stop there. Shauna Ford never found that limit. She took a border vigilante movement, wrapped herself in its flag, recruited 2 men willing to follow her orders, and on the night of May 30th, 2009, led them into a family's home in a small Arizona border town, where a 29-year-old man and his 9-year-old daughter were killed. The cause she claimed to be protecting was American sovereignty. The funding she was actually chasing was $4,000 in cash she believed was hidden inside a trailer. No drugs were ever found. No cash was ever found. But a little girl named Bersenia Flores was found, on a love seat, wearing turquoise pajama bottoms and a white t-shirt, her small hands still painted with bright red nail polish. That image is what one juror said made the death sentence possible. That image is what this story cannot move past without pausing. Shauna Ford was born on December 6, 1967, in Everett, Washington. Her early life was defined by instability and repeated encounters with the law. Court records showed juvenile convictions for theft and burglary, and additional arrests that followed her into adulthood. She moved through a series of occupations and identities over the years: cosmetologist, youth counselor, aircraft factory worker, promoter for a grunge rock band, none of them holding for long. She married multiple times. She had children. In 2007, she ran unsuccessfully for a city council seat in Everett, presenting herself as a community-minded civic figure with broad professional experience. That same year, she joined the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps, a civilian organization that patrolled the southern border and reported undocumented migrants to federal authorities. She had found, at last, a world where her appetite for authority, drama, and self-invention could be given a name and a mission. She did not stay long in that organization. Within months, she was voted out of its Washington state chapter after attempting to seize control from its leadership. Rather than stepping back, she escalated. In early 2007, she founded her own splinter group, Minutemen American Defense, known by its initials, MAD, a name that would prove, in hindsight, more accurate than she intended. The group was small,
poorly funded, and built almost entirely around Ford's forceful personality. She described it publicly as having several thousand private members. A former member would later testify it had approximately 14 active participants by the time of her arrest. What it lacked in numbers, Ford compensated for with ambition. She wanted land in southern Arizona to establish a permanent base of operations. She wanted weapons. She wanted funding. And she had arrived, by 2009, at a plan to obtain all three through a single act. The plan was built on a rumor. Raul Flores Jr., a 29-year-old resident of Arivaca, Arizona, a small, quiet community 13 miles north of the Mexican border, was believed by Ford and her associates to be a drug dealer sitting on a cash reserve of approximately $4,000. Albert Robert Gaxiola, a local MAD member who had his own reasons for wanting Flores removed, helped cultivate this belief. Ford recruited her second-in-command, Jason Eugene Bush, a man with documented ties to white supremacist organizations, to serve as the primary operative. The three met in Colorado at a truck stop in mid-May and formalized the plan. The cover story was simple. They would pose as law enforcement officers looking for fugitives. People in border communities were accustomed to uniformed strangers. It was a reasonable deception. It was also a prepared one, which tells you something about how far this plan had been thought through and for how long.
In the early hours of May 30th, 2009, Ford and her two accomplices drove to the Flores home. Raul Flores was woken by a knock at the door and the sound of people claiming to be officials searching for fugitives. His wife, Gina Gonzalez, was asleep in the bedroom. Their daughter, Brisenia, was asleep on the living room couch with her puppy. When Flores opened the door and questioned the group, Bush opened fire. Flores was struck and fatally wounded. Gonzalez was shot in the leg. Despite her injuries, she managed to retrieve a firearm and return fire, wounding Bush before the group fled. She then called 911. The recorded call, played at trial, captured the sound of a woman watching her husband die while trying to remain coherent enough to speak. Brisenia Flores, 9 years old and wholly uninvolved in anything that had brought these people to her door, did not survive. Ford was arrested approximately 2 weeks after the attack near Sierra Vista, Arizona. When investigators searched her vehicle, they found jewelry belonging to Gina Gonzalez, including her wedding ring. Text messages and recorded phone conversations linked Ford directly to the planning and execution of the home invasion. Her own sister testified at trial that Ford had spoken openly in the months before the murders about her desire to rob drug cartel figures to fund MAD's operations. The defense maintained Ford was not present inside the home at the time of the shootings and that the evidence placing her there was insufficient. Gonzalez testified that she had seen a woman in the group, stocky, Anglo, wearing camouflage, and identified that woman as Ford. The prosecution did not need her identification alone. The phone records, the jewelry, the recorded conversations, and the testimony of multiple witnesses built a portrait the defense could not effectively dismantle. The trial concluded on February 14, 2011, at Pima County Superior Court in Tucson. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 8 counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder of Gina Gonzalez, burglary, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. In the penalty phase, the jury voted unanimously to recommend death. Judge John Leonardo reviewed the full record and on February 22, 2011, formally sentenced Shauna Ford to death by lethal injection. She also received an additional 65 years in prison for the non-capital charges, to be served consecutively. Bush received the death penalty as well. Gaxiola was sentenced to life without parole. As of 2025, Shauna Ford remains on death row at the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, Lumley Unit in Goodyear, Arizona, at 57 years old. No execution date has been set. The movement she claimed to represent disavowed her within days of her arrest. The border cause she said she was fighting for had nothing to do with what happened in that trailer in Arivaca. Raul Flores Jr. and his daughter Brisenia, both American citizens, born in the United States, were targeted not for what they represented, but for what Shauna Ford believed she could take from them. She was wrong about the money. She was wrong about the drugs. She was wrong about almost everything. But the consequences of her being wrong fell entirely on a family that had done nothing to deserve any of it.
Bonnie Brown Hetty.
What transforms an ordinary Monday morning at a Catholic school into a parent's worst nightmare? How does a child's natural trust, the very innocence we cherish and nurture, become the weapon used against them? And when does greed cross the line from criminal ambition into something so unconscionable that it reshapes an entire nation's approach to child safety? The answers to these questions lie in the autumn of 1953, when a woman named Bonnie Brown Hetty walked through the doors of Notre Dame de Sion School in Kansas City and forever changed how America protects its children. Bonnie Emily Brown was born on March 20, 1912, in Chariton, Missouri. Her early life gave little indication of the infamy that would later attach itself to her name. She grew up during an era when women's options were limited, and she married early. Her husband was a bank robber, a man whose criminal lifestyle ended when he passed away. Bonnie was widowed and living in St. Joseph, Missouri, working sporadically and spending most of her time in local taverns. It was in one of these establishments that she met Carl Austin Hall, a low-level criminal with high aspirations and no moral boundaries. Carl Hall came from a prominent Kansas City family, but he had squandered every advantage his background offered. He had spent time in the Missouri State Penitentiary for robbing taxicab drivers, and during his incarceration, he began formulating what he believed would be the perfect crime. He would kidnap a child from an extraordinarily wealthy family, collect an enormous ransom, and disappear into a life of luxury. The target he selected was Robert Cosgrove Greenlease Jr., known as Bobby, the 6-year-old adopted son of a Cadillac dealer whose fortune was measured in millions. Robert Greenlease Sr. was 71 years old when Bobby was born in 1947. He and his wife Virginia had adopted the boy, and by all accounts they adored him completely. Hall was released from prison in April of 1953, and he immediately contacted Bonnie Hetty. The two rekindled their relationship, and Hall moved into Bonnie's home in St. Joseph. Both were deeply entrenched in alcoholism, reportedly consuming a bottle of whiskey each per day. In this haze of intoxication and desperation, Hall laid out his scheme. He told Bonnie exactly what he intended to do, and she agreed to participate. Her role would be essential because Hall knew he could never gain access to the child himself. He needed a woman, someone who could present herself as unthreatening, someone the school would trust. In the days leading up to September 28, 1953, Hall made meticulous preparations. He purchased a revolver, ammunition, a shovel, plastic sheeting, and a bag of lime. When questioned later about the lime, he explained that he had read it would quickly break down human remains. He used the shovel to dig a grave in the backyard of Bonnie's house. He and Bonnie composed ransom letters together. They rehearsed the story she would tell at the school. And then, on that September morning, Bonnie Brown Hetty took a taxicab to Notre Dame de Sion.
She entered the school just before 11 o'clock and approached a nun. She explained that she was Bobby Greenlease's aunt and that she needed to take him immediately because his mother had suffered a heart attack while shopping. The nun had no reason to doubt this story. She retrieved Bobby from his classroom without telling him about his mother's supposed condition. When Bobby saw Bonnie, he simply took her hand and walked with her to the waiting cab. A nun who witnessed his departure would later tell investigators that the child showed no fear, no hesitation, no sense that anything was wrong. He was trusting, just as his parents had taught him to be. Less than 1 hour after Bonnie walked out of that school with Bobby, the nuns attempted to contact the Greenlease family to check on Virginia's condition. That phone call revealed the horrible truth. There had been no heart attack. No aunt had been sent to collect Bobby. The child had been abducted. What happened next has been pieced together from confessions, physical evidence, and witness testimony. Bonnie brought Bobby to where Carl Hall was waiting. The three of them drove across the state line into Kansas. At some point during that drive or shortly after, Hall took the child's life with his revolver. Bobby Greenlease was gone before his parents even realized he had been taken. Hall and Bonnie then drove Bobby's body back to St. Joseph and buried him in the grave Hall had already prepared in Bonnie's backyard. But the Greenlease family did not know their son was already deceased. Over the following days, they received ransom letters and phone calls demanding $600,000. At the time, it was the largest ransom ever demanded in American history. Robert Greenlease contacted Arthur Eisenhower, brother of President Dwight Eisenhower and a local banker, to help arrange the cash.
The distraught father complied with every demand, following Hall's instructions precisely, desperate to save his son. On the evening of October 4th, after 2 failed attempts, Greenlease left the money in a duffel bag at a designated location near a bridge east of Kansas City. Hall retrieved the money and immediately fled to St. Louis with Bonnie. He purchased 2 metal suitcases and transferred the cash. He rented an apartment, and then in a move that would prove to be his downfall, he left Bonnie passed out in that apartment with only $2,000 from the ransom, while he took the remaining $598,000 and went on a spending spree. He hired a personal taxi driver. He stayed in motels. He bought expensive items. His lavish behavior attracted attention. On October 6, 1953, authorities arrested Carl Hall at the Townhouse Hotel in St. Louis. He quickly gave up Bonnie's location and she was arrested that same night, still intoxicated, still unaware that Hall had abandoned her. The following morning, October 7th, FBI agents arrived at Bonnie's home in St. Joseph. They found Bobby Greenlease's small body buried near the porch, wrapped in plastic, covered with lime. The Greenlease family dentist confirmed the identification that same afternoon. Initially, both Hall and Bonnie attempted to blame a fictitious third person, but within days they confessed to the kidnapping. On October 30th, 1953, they appeared before Judge Albert Reeves in federal court in Kansas City and entered guilty pleas. The trial began on November 19th. The jury heard the evidence and deliberated for only 1 hour and 8 minutes before recommending the ultimate penalty. Judge Reeves sentenced them immediately, stating that it was the most brutal case he had ever tried. Neither Hall nor Bonnie attempted any appeals. They resigned themselves to their fate. On December 18, 1953, just 81 days after they had taken Bobby Greenlease from his school, Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie Brown Hetty were executed together in Missouri's gas chamber at the state penitentiary in Jefferson City. Hall was pronounced deceased at 12:12 in the morning. Bonnie was pronounced deceased 20 seconds later. She was 41 years old. She became only the second woman executed under federal authority in the 20th century. The Greenlease kidnapping changed America. Schools across the nation immediately instituted strict protocols about who could remove children from campus. Written authorization became mandatory. The casual trust that had allowed Bonnie to walk out with Bobby simply by claiming to be his aunt was replaced with verification systems that remain in place today. The case also left an enduring mystery. Of the $600,000 in ransom money, less than half was ever recovered. It is widely believed that the missing funds were taken by corrupt law enforcement officials and eventually made their way to organized crime figures, though this has never been proven. The Greenlease family never recovered. Bobby's half-siblings both passed away young. The parents spent the remainder of their lives in grief. And Bonnie Brown Hetty's name became forever synonymous with one of the most heinous acts imaginable, the betrayal of a child's trust for nothing more than money. Her participation in that crime secured her place in history, but not as she and Carl Hall had imagined. They wanted fortune. Instead, they received infamy. And their executions brought justice that arrived swiftly, but could never undo the devastation they had caused.
Marilyn Plants. Behind the cheerful smile of a Sunday school teacher and the routine of a suburban homemaker, can darkness grow undetected? How does someone compartmentalize their existence so completely that they can serve others spiritually while plotting to end the life of the person they promised to cherish? The story of Marilyn K. Plants forces us to examine the terrifying gap between public persona and private intention, between the person we show the world and the choices we make when we believe no one is watching. Marilyn K. Plants appeared to embody everything her quiet Midwest city, Oklahoma neighborhood valued. She taught Sunday school. She raised her 2 children in a home that seemed stable and respectable. She maintained relationships with friends and neighbors who would have been shocked to learn what she was planning in the summer of 1988. Her husband, James Earl Plants, worked the night shift as a press room supervisor at the Daily Oklahoman. At 33 years old, he was the primary breadwinner for their family. To the outside world, they seemed like an ordinary working-class couple navigating the challenges of marriage, parenthood, and bills. But beneath that surface, Marilyn's life had taken a turn that would prove irreversible. She had begun an affair with a teenager named William Clifford Bryson.
The relationship was inappropriate on multiple levels, not least because of the significant age difference. But Marilyn saw Bryson as something more than a secret romance. She saw him as her future. And standing between her and that future was her husband James. Marilyn later claimed that James had threatened to take his own life if she ever divorced him. Whether this was true or simply a justification she manufactured to explain her next actions remains unclear. What is certain is that instead of pursuing a legal separation or divorce, Marilyn began discussing a different solution with Bryson. She wanted James gone permanently, and she wanted to profit from his passing. James had a life insurance policy worth approximately $300,000. In Marilyn's mind, this money would fund her new life with Bryson. All she needed was for someone to carry out what she could not. Marilyn provided Bryson with baseball bats. She discussed timing and logistics. She told Bryson and his friend Clinton Eugene McKimble that they would wait in her living room for James to return home from his late shift. Her children, aged 9 and 5, would be asleep in their bedrooms. She would remain in another room, and when James walked through the door, exhausted from a night of work, Bryson and McKimble would attack him. On August 26, 1988, the plan was executed. Bryson and McKimble spent the evening at the plant's home. According to later testimony, they consumed alcohol and used substances while they waited. At some point, they fell asleep. When they heard the jingle of keys at the door, they woke up with a mission. James Plants entered his own home unsuspecting and was immediately set upon. The attack was fierce and sustained. After beating James with the baseball bats Marilyn had provided, they carried his body to his pickup truck. Then they set the vehicle ablaze, hoping to destroy any trace of what had occurred. Early that Friday morning, authorities discovered James Plants's body in his burned truck. The initial assumption was that he had been the victim of a carjacking or robbery gone wrong, but as investigators began piecing together the evidence, they discovered inconsistencies. Witness statements emerged. People came forward who had heard Bryson discussing the plan. One individual, a man named Ferris, testified that Bryson had approached him weeks earlier in a grocery store and offered him $10,000 to take James's life. Bryson had introduced Ferris to Marilyn, saying she was the one I was telling you about that would kill your husband. Marilyn had told Ferris it needed to look like an accident.
The investigation quickly focused on Marilyn, Bryson, and McKimble. All three were arrested and charged. McKimble, recognizing the strength of the evidence against him, accepted a plea bargain. In exchange for a life sentence, he agreed to testify against Marilyn and Bryson, providing detailed accounts of how the plan had been devised and carried out. The trial began in March of 1989. Prosecutors presented a damning case. They showed that Marilyn had orchestrated every aspect of the crime, from recruiting the participants to providing the weapons to ensuring she had an alibi by remaining in another room while her husband was attacked. They demonstrated that her motive was purely financial, that she intended to collect on James's life insurance and use that money to start a new life with her teenage lover. The jury heard testimony about how Marilyn had discussed the murder openly with multiple people, showing no remorse or hesitation. Neither Marilyn nor Bryson testified in their own defense. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree manslaughter, conspiracy to commit that act, solicitation, and arson for burning the truck. The next day, during the penalty phase, jurors deliberated for 5 hours before recommending the ultimate punishment for both Marilyn Plants and William Clifford Bryson. The judge sentenced them accordingly. Marilyn also received 100 years for solicitation, 10 years for conspiracy, and 15 years for arson. Over the next 12 years, Marilyn pursued appeals. She argued ineffective assistance of counsel. She claimed that she deserved mercy, but every appeal was denied. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed her conviction and sentence. Her case reached the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear it on February 26, 2001. Attorney General Drew Edmondson immediately requested that an execution date be set. A controversy arose in the weeks before Marilyn's scheduled execution. An FBI review had revealed serious problems with the work of Joyce Gilchrist, a chemist for the Oklahoma City Police Department who had testified in Marilyn's trial. The report found that Gilchrist had misidentified evidence and given questionable testimony in multiple cases.
The Oklahoma Criminal Defense Trial Lawyers Association called for a moratorium on all executions, beginning with Maryland's, until Gilchrist's work could be thoroughly reviewed. However, prosecutors and Governor Frank Keating determined that Gilchrist's testimony in Maryland's case had been limited and not critical to the conviction. Other evidence was overwhelming. The execution would proceed. Marilyn's daughter, Trina Plants Wells, who was 21 years old and had recently reconciled with her mother, submitted a videotaped plea to the State Pardon and Parole Board. Through tears, she begged for her mother's life to be spared, saying she could not bear the thought of forgiving her and then losing her to execution. But James's sister, Karen Lowry, urged the board to deny clemency. She stated that Marilyn had shown no remorse during the preliminary hearing or trial, and that she believed in the deterrent power of capital punishment. The board voted to deny clemency. On May 1, 2001, Marilyn K. Plants was transported to the execution chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. She was 40 years old. Bryson had already been executed the previous June. As the intravenous tubes were fastened to her arm, Marilyn prayed. In her final statement, she spoke of her love for her family and thanked each of her witnesses by name. "If you want to see me again, you must be born again," she said. 4 minutes after the injection began, at 9:11 in the evening, Marilyn Plants was pronounced deceased. She became only the second woman executed in Oklahoma's history, both of them in the same year. Wanda Jean Allen had been executed in January. Marilyn was the 124th person executed in Oklahoma and the 11th that year. The life insurance money never went to Marilyn. It was eventually awarded to her 2 children, Trina and Chris, who had lost both their father to violence and their mother to her own choices. James's father, Earl Plants, raised the children through their grief and confusion, providing them with counseling and honesty about what had happened. After more than a decade of waiting, the family finally had what they considered closure, but the scars, they acknowledged, would never fully heal.